So as a clinical psychologist, I'm often asked, how do you listen to people's problems day in and day out? How do you stand it, people's pain? Don't you get burnt out? And truth be told, when I was new as a therapist and so young and full of pompous zeal that I could go in and fix people's lives, yes, I used to get overwhelmed and so overburdened. It seemed as if their pain on top of mine was simply too hard to metabolize. But that wasn't really because of the therapeutic environment, and it certainly wasn't because my clients were dumping their pain on me. It was because my own relationship to pain was skewed. You see, back then, in my naivety, I used to view pain and problems as an intrinsic failure of the self, certainly of the other, and definitely of life. But now, as I've evolved just a tad and grown up, I've come to redefine my relationship with pain, begun to see its entry, its presence, and its ability to transform in an entirely different way. And it is insights from this transformed relationship to pain that I wish to share with you today. For I believe there is nothing more pivotal in the journey of conscious parenting or conscious living than the understanding, integration, and evolution of pain. For nothing hurts the parental heart more than to see our children in pain. But guess what? Nothing hurts our children more than to have a parent who is unable to witness their pain. A parent who is unable to witness the child's pain because of the parent's own unresolved issues around pain, failure, disappointment. That child who doesn't have that witness will simply be unable to integrate pain in their own life and use it as a vehicle for growth. So now, I no longer see pain as something so dark and dire and disruptive, something to be avoided at all costs. On the contrary, I see it as not only as profound, but as inevitable. And not only as just inevitable, but as intrinsic. And not only as just intrinsic, but vital. And mostly as one of the most powerful portals of consciousness we can have. You know, if you ask me what kinds of pain I've experienced as a therapist, what kinds of pain I have been witness to, as if pain could be categorized into different kinds, I will probably say I've seen mostly all of it. From the mother whose eyes scream of a despair bordering on an insanity as she whispers to me the most ungraspable of realities. And then she was gone, she whispers. I looked away for 2 minutes, and then she was gone. Speaking of her toddler who tottered into the pool, unsupervised, for just a blink of an eye, and then she was gone. Or the man who stands before me, shaking his head in disbelief as he watches his company that he invested millions of dollars in dissolve before his eyes, unable to comprehend the reality of the mountain of debt before him, unable to see how this pain can be transformational. Or the unsuspecting wife who sits on the couch as her husband turns to her and tells her, "No, I do not love you anymore, and I really need to leave." And he too, filled with pain himself, walks out of the office and out of her life, leaving her mouth agape in disbelief, the torrential dismay, anxiety, fear, and betrayal. And the teenager who bawls and she tells me, "My best friend told me I was fat and stupid." It's always the best friend. And she looks at me imploringly, wondering if I could give her some intelligence and beauty by the next school day. Abandonment, suffering, loneliness, fear, death, betrayal, pain. The pain of suffering, it's too much to bear. It's almost as if our psychological anatomies simply are not designed to contain the pain that life hurtles at us. Pain leaves a stain. Pain must be painted over, for it cracks our sense of self almost, leaving it in a million shards, not shards that you can just leave on the roadside, if only we were so lucky. No, but the shards, they prick our footsteps every walking minute, bleeding, reminding us that we are broken, broken, broken. Life wasn't supposed to be this way. This is what They told us as children that life was this fairy tale. Now, most of us sitting here today will say, no, we love life as is. We think life is beautiful as is. But I ask you, do you really mean that? Because I believe in the shadow of your love for life lies a conditionality, lies a transactional element that we make a transaction with life, a contract, that if life makes us feel beautiful and valued and splendorous and wonderful and strong, valorous, then we will love life. Then we will be able to go outside and look at the sun and admire the sky. But when life breaks its contract with us, the contract that only we set up with it, and instead reflects back to us our weakness, our limitations, our fragility, it's almost then as if we withdraw, recoil, and divorce life itself. And these conditions, these transactions, these unspoken contracts, we're making them with everyone, with ourselves, with others, and with our children. This is how we raise our children, with unconditional love, filled with transactions. How many parents have you heard tell their children, I have so much love to give you. All you need to do is be good. We tell our children from a young age that they must succeed, they must excel, they must be great at whatever they do, not for the sake of greatness itself, but so we can fill our inner void. So our children, young as they are, they don't even realize, but they come really to fulfill our unmet legacies and our unmet expectations. And their little shoulders weary with the burden of making mommy and daddy happy and whole and full is almost too much for them to bear. And they forsake their authentic selves. Our children are so kind to us. Even those who rebel, they have forsaken their authentic self, the ones who comply well. Look at the fairy tales we teach our children with, sanitized and whitewashed. Disney does a great job. You know, the original fairy tales were nothing like the Disney stories we read now. Sleeping Beauty, you think she was awoken by this handsome, dashing prince? No, he raped her. The original story goes that as she was lying there, he came upon her, and he was so besotted by his egoic desire to overpower and control and be dominated by his earthly desires that he rapes her. And she wakes up not with a gentle kiss from the dashing prince, but from the birth of her children, one of whom sucks on her finger and takes out the poison, mistaking it for the bosom. But what a story, I know, dark and very dire to tell our children, but it teaches them subconsciously that do not lie passively waiting, dependent on some prince, because you will be screwed. In this case, literally. And the frog prince who must be magically exterminated, the frog in us all, by this magical kiss again, because love apparently conquers everything, I'm told. Even the frog within us. But that's not how the original story was told. So the frog goes to the girl, whoever she was, this beautiful damsel, and begs for her to kiss him to be rid of this curse. But the girl in this story, she's smart, and she will not be taken for a fool for the frog. And so she slams the frog against the wall, and the frog shatters his external egoic self. And then his humanity is revealed, telling children again, there is no kiss from another that will save you from your own dark, deep shadow. And your earthly, egoic self will only be shattered by a lot of pain. And after pain will come your humanity. And Cinderella, you know, he just didn't find her by slipping on the glass slipper. No, the first stepsister, she cut her heel off, and the fool of the prince believed that it was her. And then the dove told him, no, it isn't her. So then the next stepsister was a little smarter. She cut off her toes to fit into the slipper, and again the prince believed her, until the dove said no. And then he found Cinderella. Again, a testament to life's journey, that true love, our true soul partners, will only be discovered after a process of discernment of self and other. But none of these valuable life lessons are being taught to our children in the Disney stories. So they live their lives, our children, believing that it's this unattainable fantasy that needs to be their life, and anything other than that is simply too excruciating to bear. So we teach our children to sanitize their emotions, to sanitize pain, to pretend that it doesn't exist. Because our deepest fear is that our children will feel pain. Not because our children are unable to feel pain, but because it is we who are so scared to confront our emptiness. Because in our naivety, we believe emptiness means nothingness. If only we realize that it is when we surrender to that emptiness, it is essentially fullness and oneness. But that emptiness is so terrifying to touch that we will avoid it at all costs. So we will inject fullness in our lives in any other way possible. The dope in the syringe, the collagen in the jowls, in the cheeks, under the eyes. Anything to give an appearance of fullness. It doesn't matter if the end result is a bland rendition of what was, an overproduced, tightly controlled micromanagement, as long as it denies what lies underneath. I was exposed to my deep resistance to pain and my naive and zealous attachment to form and ego through a Buddhist mandala ceremony. So there I was in beautiful Aspen. We greeted these monks who came from India, gregarious monks, something I didn't expect because, monks have to be very, very serious, very self-contained. But here were these gregarious, giggling monks playing football with us and ping pong, and that in itself was such a fascination. The monks, they're just like us. And then they began their mandala ceremony, and that's when I realized that their spiritual training is far beyond our lifetime. So then they begin the mandala ceremony. 4 monks hunched over a table, grain after grain, crystal after crystal, dot after dot. A lesson in impermanence, we all knew that. And I could really stay there in the moment, witnessing for the first hour. But these mandala ceremonies, they take days. So after the first hour, out came the phone. And darn it, no Wi-Fi here. So I thought to myself, I've watched 1,000 sand crystals fall. It will be okay if I don't come back until almost the end. So I told the head monk, why don't you call me back when we're near the end result? Because I've seen this, I get this. I've seen the drop and the drop, and I get it, I'm good to go. So call me when you're near the end, but not like at the end, because then I will just look like such a fake. Call me towards the last. I can sit for another hour. So 4 or 5 days later, I come back, delighted that those sands, those unambiguous form shapes, had transformed into this mystical, multi-layered platform of aesthetics. I was so excited. I thought the whole town would come and gather me and we would admire the monks and gawk and just revel in the aesthetics. So then, towards the end, the last monk with the last sand, the last crystal, and he stood up. The mandala was complete. And I thought, this must surely be followed by some pomp and splendor, some thunderous applause. But nothing like this. The monks, they went, they washed their hands. In 10 minutes, they came back to complete the ceremony. You know what that means. They're going to destroy it. 10 minutes, no. Now, I understand impermanence, but why impermanate something beautiful? I just didn't understand. Impermanate the ugly, impermanate the evil, but not in 10 minutes impermanate something so beautiful. No, it couldn't be. But yes, they came back, and out came the long-necked trumpets, and there began the ceremony of destruction. And I resisted, and I saw the monk take out his brush, and as if I had spotted the murderer in the room, I wanted to scream, no, there, he's got the gun, he's going to kill the mandala. But my egoic investment in looking wise took over, and I sat still, very zen, mirroring the nonchalance I saw on their face, later realizing it was just my pedestrian understanding of deep reverence. So he took out the brush and whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. The mandala had disappeared, and in its place was a heap of sand. And my resistance, resistance, resistance. What a waste, what a waste, what a waste. And then we walked to the lake, and I was muttering, what a waste, what a waste, what a waste. And the chanting continued. And then we reached the lake, And the children, they delighted because the monks allowed them to throw the sand into the water. What a waste, what a waste, what a waste. And then the sand, it touched the water. And then it transformed into this ethereal plume of smoke, gray, almost pink. And I'm resisting, resisting, resisting. And then I got it. My epiphanic moment came. Death did occur, but nothing was destroyed. The smoke was created. The children's delight was created. The invitation by the lake to change its color by the sand was created. The only thing that was destroyed, thankfully, was my ignorance. And our children, too, are the same. They delight in change, in change, in change. They can change form effortlessly because they do not hold on to the egoic agenda of what was or what should be. So I ask you today, for those of you who have children in your lives, to follow their lead because they will take you into the present moment like no one else can. It is just our resistance to enter the new. So I ask you, are you ready to enter the new? Are you ready? Well then, you must be ready to die. Thank you.